Building an ITX gaming PC is typically a very expensive process, but I figured out how to build a very powerful one on a budget, and I'm going to show you how I did it. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf, where I build and benchmark all sorts of gaming PCs like this one here on YouTube, but I also stream over on Twitch every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern time, so make sure you're following me over there. But before that, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below and also that notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But yeah, let's check this build out after a word from today's sponsor. Big thanks to Dashlane and their incredible password management tool for sponsoring today's video. I'm sure you've heard of Dashlane, but if you haven't, it's essentially a secure password management tool that can generate crazy complex passwords for all your websites. That way you aren't writing them down, or even worse, using the same password on multiple websites. Dashlane not only stores all of your passwords, but can then autofill them into websites, which is super quick and easy to use, such as here when you're logging into your battle.net account, and even when you're slaying all of those PC hardware deals over on eBay. On top of that, they also fill out forms such as your info and credit cards, saving you a ton of time online. Hackers these days are trying to steal our social media passwords or even our PC game launcher passwords just so they can sell them off. Imagine how much it would suck if you lost your Steam account password, or even worse, your YouTube account password. Dashlane also makes your online life more secure by providing you with a VPN so you can browse the internet without being tracked. So make your digital life safer and easier by heading over to dashlane.com/ZTT to get Dashlane for free on your first device. Then when you want to upgrade to premium, use my code ZTT to save 25%. Jumping straight into the parts list, everything's linked down in the description by the way. Starting with the CPU, just like all my build guides, we have the Intel 4th generation i5-4570. Remember that this is a used build, so we're trying to keep things low in price, and you can actually find this 4-core and 4-threaded CPU that boosts up to 3.6 GHz on eBay for as cheap as $35, which is what I did. For the motherboard, this is the one that I actually already had in my studio, so it was an easy pick. This is the ASRock H97M ITX AC, but I would recommend just going with any ITX motherboard that'll support Intel's 4th generation CPUs for as cheap as you can. In a build like this, I'm certainly not going to be overclocking, and I'm not taking any real advantage of the motherboard features, so I would just suggest getting the cheapest one that you can. I'm going to mark the price at $50 even though I already have one. For RAM, this here is a 16GB DDR3 kit that's clocked at 1600 MHz, and DDR3 is getting really tough to find these days, but hopefully that changes soon. I found this kit for $50, but I honestly feel like that was a really great deal, even though it's the same price as DDR4. Moving on, we get to the graphics card, and I decided to use my 4GB RX 570, which I picked up for $80 on the used market, and I originally bought this graphics card for my top 3 budget GPUs under $100 video, which you should check out up here. The RX 570 is actually a really solid combination with the i5-4570 despite being much newer, and I wouldn't stress too much about the 4GB of VRAM because with the 1080p settings that the system is geared for, I don't even think we take advantage of those extra 4GB compared to an 8GB model. Moving on to the power supply, where the market is extremely limited at the time of making this video, I had to settle on a whopping $66 EVGA M1 550 watt power supply. You guys know by now that I've been recommending this thing in a ton of my budget build guides, mostly because of the all black cables, and it usually sits at like a stupid low price point of like $40 or so, but unfortunately with the market right now, that's at like $66, and that's still stupid low compared to most other options. Do be aware that the EVGA M1 is not nearly the safest and most efficient power supply that you can go with. It's actually ranked on the tier E of the famous Linus Tech Tips power supply ranking list, but I've had exactly 0 issues using them over the years, so I'm going to continue to recommend them in my build guides, especially the budget ones. Something else that I recommend, although it's similarly against the grain, is the SSD choice of the Silicon Power A55 500GB model. The A55 is definitely one of the cheaper SSD options out there because there's no DRAM. This means that it's not necessarily the best choice for a boot SSD with your operating system on it, but to be honest, with these super budget build guides, it'll work absolutely just fine. It's also sporting 560 over 530 megabit per second read and write speeds. And finally, for our last core component of the build, we gotta talk about this case. This is the Metallic Gear Neo Mini version 2, and this thing cost me $70 brand new off Amazon. The Neo Mini version 2 is certainly one of the bigger ITX cases out there, but I thought that it would be perfect for honestly my first first ever complete ITX build. The $1,250 all black build that I uploaded a few weeks ago was actually built after this one, and it allowed me to get away with the super cheap non-modular power supply like the one we used. Typically in an ITX build, space is extremely critical, and you definitely won't be able to get away with a non-modular power supply because the bulk of the cables is just so huge. On the back of the mini version 2, there's this slot with Velcro straps that's designed for that exact reason, as you can see here, but even then I really had to smash the back side panel on, as you can see me doing here on my Twitch live stream, which is where I assembled this, by the way, and all my other build guides. Other than that though, there's not a ton of airflow, just these vents on the side of the front panel, which I'm not too worried about. I'm also really digging the design of the tempered glass side panel that sort of acts like a power supply shroud, and once again, tell me if you've heard this before, but I just like the clean and simple design to this. I think the mini version 2 was a great option for a first time ITX builder, as I did need to get a little crafty with the cable management, but it was still big enough for me to use a non-modular power supply and wasn't an absolute pain to work in. Before checking out the entire parts list, I did throw in one aesthetic only part, which you guys know I don't include in the final price tag because they have absolutely no impact on performance. These RGB fans are the brand new MF120 GTs from Deepcool, and they have a really unique X design to them. These 3 packs are a little expensive, but I always like the Deepcool physical interface of their RGB products because they all work so well together, and I think they look pretty legit. The other non-necessary part I have is this cheapo Thermaltake air cooler. I would highly recommend just going with the Intel stock cooler if your 4570 comes with one, not because it's a good cooler or anything, but just because it's cheap, and unless you're overclocking, you'll be perfectly fine with it. With that being said, here's what my final parts list is looking like, and as you can see, everything totaled out to be just a tad bit over $400 for our used ITX gaming PC. Before moving on to the benchmarks, I want to quickly talk about some replacement parts if you're thinking about copying this build. Maybe you can't find one of these parts in stock, or maybe you just don't like the aesthetics of one of these parts, so I definitely got you covered. And just like always, every part that I'm about to talk about is linked down in the description as well. For the CPU, the 4570 is a really nice option strictly for gaming, but if you want to upgrade to something more capable with hyper-threading, you could always go with something like the 4790K, but only if you get a really good deal on it. Otherwise, I'd switch over to the Ryzen platform. For the graphics card, I really love the RX 570 as my first pick here, but for around the same price, you could certainly get a GTX 970, which is still rocking some insane price to performance value here in 2020. If you're not vibing with the Neo Mini version 2 case, you can swap it out for something like the Fantex Evolve ITX, which I also really like. And finally, if you don't want to spend the extra money on these MF120 GT RGB fans, you can use my personal favorite budget option here from Up Here. You can usually find a 3-pack for just over 20 bucks, and they're pretty decent quality. I actually just used them in my $700 gaming PC build guide that I released a few weeks ago. So there's some extra parts from you, but now it's time for my favorite part of these videos, the benchmarks. And just like always, please continue to let me know what you think down in the comment section of what other games I should add to my benchmarking run. But today, I got 10 games for you guys, so let's get these cranking. Starting with Fortnite, just like always, I put the settings at 1080p in Pro, that's 1080p low but with far view distance, and with that I got a solid FPS average of 148. Keep in mind, if you lock the FPS at your monitor's refresh rate instead of unlimited, which is what I do for benchmarking, your 1% and 0.1% loads will be significantly higher because it's not wasting power outputting more FPS than what your monitor can actually display. Next up was Call of Duty Modern Warfare. I actually decided to benchmark this during Warzone just because of how popular this is getting. To be specific, I actually did the new huge Warzone 50 vs 50 team deathmatch, so it was really graphically demanding, and in 1080p and medium settings I got 71 frames per second. Following that was Rainbow Six Siege, starting to actually complete these situations during all these benchmarking runs I've been doing lately, and with the benchmarking tool in 1080p and very high settings, this build got 136 FPS. Borderlands 3 followed up after that, definitely a GPU demanding game to run, and in 1080p and medium settings, this budget ITX system got just over our target 60 FPS mark. Next up, I tested Gears 5, and with the built-in benchmarking tool in 1080p and medium settings, we got again a little bit above the target 60 FPS mark. And after that, I fired up a game that I haven't benchmarked for a while, Red Dead Redemption 2, but it's actually a very demanding game with an easy built-in benchmarking tool, so I thought I would add it to the lineup, and in 1080p and medium settings, I got 53 FPS. Counter-Strike Global Offensive was up next, and in 1080p in Pro settings, which is essentially just low with no anti-aliasing, I got 160 frames per second. That's about as best as a 4570 can do here in 2020. After that was PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. I can't for the life of me record a kill during these benchmarking runs, so just try to enjoy me playing this game as a walking simulator, and in 1080p and medium settings, we got 72 frames per second. Getting towards the end here, we have Monster Hunter World. This one was definitely starved by our older i5 4570, and in 1080p, I had to crank the settings down to low and still only got a 42 FPS average. This one is certainly tough to do with older and budget CPUs. And finally, for the 10th and final game, we have Forza Horizon 4. I can't run MSI Afterburner on this one, so we'll just have to rely high with the built-in benchmarking tool, and in 1080p and high settings with dynamic optimization turned off, I got a very solid 93 FPS average. So there you go. As you can see, this budget ITX system is running any esport title at 144 FPS, and even all the AAA titles at about 1080p and medium for 60 FPS. And not only are you getting those nice price to performance numbers, but you're also getting a really nice looking ITX gaming PC. Just like always, please continue to let me know what other build guide prices you want to see me do in the future, and also make sure you're following me over on TikTok, because I actually made a video about this PC weeks ago because it's a much faster social media platform to get content out to you guys. I hope you enjoyed this one.